good positioning cannot be reclaimed. You guys, once we have exited the building, once we've initiated a movement, once we've entered the tunnel of load, and in fact, this is how we start to think about movement, is that we have kind of position 1. We'll call this position start and position finish. And when I was just working with Dave and Jake, they were teaching me I had to be organized to move from this position to effectively get into a good position over here. And how I exited and how I entered determined the 100% of my outcomes. Basically, they didn't even have to talk about what was going on in the middle very much, because if I was in a good position here, I entered this window or tunnel, then I could exit the tunnel also in a good position. And these start positions and finish positions are really important. And you'll hear this coaching idea in other athletes and other coaches. Louis Simmons says, hey, sometimes the easiest way to understand the movement is to start where you finish. So if I start at the top of the deadlift, it's an easier way for me to work my way back in. If you are in a bad position at the start, a little thoracic rounding when you're front squatting, you cannot reclaim that good position under load. Once you've entered load or speed, or you've entered this movement position we call the tunnel, who you are in the tunnel is who you are when you exit the tunnel. So that means if I'm not externally rotated and my knee comes in and my foot is dropped, I cannot reclaim that good knee position when I'm front squatting. You guys know what I'm talking about? You're like, knee out! Totally, bam, knee out. And that never happens, right? You're like, okay, coach, tink. Or like you're deadlifting your athletes and you're like, hey, flatten your back. No, okay, I'm trying. 1 second. Flat. Right? When you see Dave Lipson front squatting 500 pounds and his elbows come down a little bit and you're like, elbows up. You're like, totally. Never happens. Once you're lost position or surrender that position of dominance or that organization, you cannot reclaim that good position. So it's lost potential. So I'll take another 5% on you because you're in a bad position setting up. So we need to ask ourselves, how are we in a good position to start, and then are we in a good position to finish? That's you. That's how I see you. A little cuter than that, but not much. Then what we try to do is get into this concept of kind of the way we think about classic men's gymnastics on the rings. And classic men's gymnastics have got it right. They basically reduce all the other variables in the spine and in the body, and they just move their shoulders around. How easy is men's gymnastics now, right? Become really stiff, and if you're just strong enough, you know, iron cross doesn't seem like a big deal. You know, all the levers, all the that's what men's gymnastics is. And what we want to try to do is reduce the number of variables in the spine and reduce the number of variables out in the joint to just stabilizing at the prime mover. And in this situation, you have basically 2 prime movers. The first prime mover is your shoulder, and the second prime mover is your hip. And what's nice to think about this is that most athletic events, most sports, it's all about creating effective hip extension, right? That's primarily what we're saying. And now if I try to treat the human being as if it has a single hip, then a lot of my mechanical issues revolve around creating stability and idealizing hip motion and hip movement. What's nice about the one joint rule is that as soon as I see you squat and I break, do you see how I broke and overextended my spine a little bit? How many hip joints do I have now? Like 5, like 7, like 17, right? And every single one of those joints I'm going to have to control and manage that axis of rotation. So the second I see a flexion fault or an extension fault, that's a problem because I've introduced multiple joints to this neutral system, and I'm going to have to control for that. And it's also a force bleed. The other problem is that we said if I tilt the thoracic spine or tilt the pelvis one way or the other, I no longer can control the joint, because we're set up to create a very stable, strong platform off of a neutral trunk. And the second I overextend or the second I break, I no longer have control over the shoulder, and I internally rotate and I'm back into my open circuit fault default. Does that make sense to you guys? What's nice and convenient about this also maybe this isn't you, maybe that offends you. I also see you this way. You're basically a rigid, stable structure with the same joint on either side. So the one joint rule means that if I understand how the hip joint works, I understand how the shoulder joint works, and that they're approximately the same joint. The only difference is that the shoulder joint floats around on the thoracic spine. It floats around on the trunk. So once I account for the stability, shing, of the shoulder on the thoracic spine, then suddenly the joint mechanic is exactly the same down here. This is why this is flexion and this is flexion. Both are flexion. Does that make sense? And what you're going to start to find once I understand these problems is that most of the downstream issues of elbow and wrist and ankle and knee are resultant from faults that arise much closer to the trunk. And so if I can control the trunk and then control for the position of the primary one joint, then a lot of the other mechanics clean themselves up automatically. Does that make sense? And this also fits back into our model of functional movement. Wave of contraction from trunk to periphery. And so if I'm disorganized at the trunk, I'm disorganized at the prime mover, I'm going to see disorganization through the whole kinetic chain. Does that make sense? Every movement that we do, basically except for cycling, which I fix my butt and move my leg around really fast. It's a really weird sport. But even running, leg is on the ground and I'm stable, and I have to control the pelvis on a stable femur. Everything else, besides basically, I can think maybe swimming is the other one where the leg is loose. So what's nice about this is that I can make some generalized rules. In flexion, and this is in both this is for the shoulder and the hip. It's the one joint. In all movements of flexion, the stable joint position is external rotation. Flexion plus external rotation. Say that out loud. Flexion and external rotation. Good. Now let's see what that means. Because you're like, flexion, external, what the hell is he talking about? What I'm talking about is this. Flexion, external rotation is these stable positions where the joint has the most congruency and the joint becomes the most stable and my movers become most effective. Arm goes up overhead. Bergner tells me to get my armpit forward. I'm in external rotation, end range flexion. Make sense?